Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free Microsoft 7680 certification training course. I'm James Messer, and this module we're going to look at deploying a system image. This comes from our requirements of the 7680 exam in that second section where we needed to deploy Windows 7. And the option here is we need to understand the automated deployment methods and how you might manually also deploy an image that you've already customized. As you recall from one of our previous videos, we created an entire image and customized it. We added our own drivers. We used the DISM command to customize the image itself. We created a lot of different configuration settings inside of that image, but there are a number of other ways that you could create an image and then customize it as well. One of the ways is to use Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010. This is also referred to as MDT. And one thing about this entire chapter is there are a number of different options in here and programs you can use, and almost all of them have some type of abbreviation. The Microsoft Deployment Toolkit we're going to use to make that entire process a lot easier. It's a nice graphical front end. It allows you to automate a lot of things that we manually did with DISM at the command line. We are also going to show you how to deploy this with Windows Deployment Services, or WDS. We talked about WDS in an earlier video. One of the great advantages of WDS is that it uses something called multicast technologies, which means we can set up a number of machines and they can all be deployed at one time. We can set up 50, 100, a lot of different computers at once, get them ready to go. You hit one button and now all of those computers can all get the image simultaneously. So it is an extremely fast and extremely efficient way to deploy Windows 7 to many different systems all at one time. Another thing we're going to talk about is System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM, and the version that currently is available is 2007. This is something that you commonly see in a very, very, very large enterprise. So this is something that you'll see centralized to be able to roll out patches, to update applications, to do inventories of systems. It does a lot more than just be able to roll out Windows 7. We're going to learn a little bit more about that in this video as well. A couple of different technologies that you're going to hear about whenever we begin rolling out operating systems, and in our case, Windows 7, is two different things. Something called a light touch installation is the first one you'll see. And this is where you are deploying your operating system into an environment that may not have this big, large central infrastructure for management. You'll see this in medium-sized businesses, even large-sized businesses that don't have a formal systems management infrastructure. So you'll see this a lot if somebody just needs to deploy a few systems, a handful of systems, or they're not interested in managing one of these really, really big centralized system management infrastructures. Normally, you'll see those deployed in very large environments, and that allows you to do something called zero-touch installation. That's when you're integrating with something like Systems Management Server, SMS, that version is 2003, or the thing we talked about earlier, the System Center Configuration Manager, or SCCM 2007, because those central methods are used to be able to do not just deployment of operating systems, but also push out patches, and also be able to update the software on somebody's workstation. So we're trying to do this all in an image, but what if you could just push out a generic image and then use one of these large infrastructure systems to be able to also push out patches later on, to be able to push out new applications whenever the user needs them? You don't have to wrap those up inside of an image. So it gives you a few more options available. In fact, it extends and expands the number of things that you're able to do because you don't have to really bundle it all into a single image. A lot of advantages with that, but there's a lot of management associated with that. So it's a trade-off. Sometimes people are just happy with a light touch installation system rather than something that's more comprehensive that would allow you to do zero touch. When we were building our WIM, our Windows image file, you recall we added new drivers to the image. We were able to update applications and patches with the DISM command. Well, using MDT 2010, we're going to perform a similar function. We're going to manage our WIMs. We can manage many, many different images all in one place. We can add drivers and applications and patches and a lot of things to that image. We're going to also need something that we've already used before, the Windows Automated Installation Kit, the Windows AIK. We loaded noted that in an earlier video, it's actually required to be able to do this management with MDT 2010. So first you'll install the Windows AIK, then you'll install the MDT 2010 to make sure all of the things that you need are going to work properly. Now, all of the things that we did at the command line with DISM, the mounting of an image, the adding of a driver, the listing of all the different drivers, the configuring, enabling, and disabling of certain features and applications, we all did that at the command line, but with MDT 2010, it's all on a graphical front end. It's all automated for us in a lot of ways. We'll simply click and add the drivers we want to a particular package, and we're done. We don't have to know any command line parameters. We don't have to have them on a certain place. We simply add them into the MDT 2010, and it takes it from there. We're back on our Cheyenne server. If you recall, we used this server in a previous video. Under All Programs, you'll see the Microsoft Windows AIK. This is where we deployed our WIM files. We configured it with DISM. I have installed onto this server the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. So this is something we can use using the Deployment Workbench. And this Deployment Workbench allows us to work with images and be able to do a lot of the things we were doing at the command line integrated into this really nice user interface. On the left side of the screen, you'll see by default, this deployment workbench has nothing in it. So you'll see by default an Information Center folder, which has a lot of the getting started documentation, how-to documents, a lot of the things that we're going to do in this video, you'll be able to find right there in the documentation. Directly underneath that folder is the Deployment Shares folder. And this is where you start building the grouping of your images and your drivers and everything else. And as you can see, I do not have a deployment share currently, so let's make one. I don't have any shares set up on here for deployment. So we're going to do a new deployment share. We'll put it at our /deployment share. That's a fine place to put it. That is the default. And it says, what name would you like to use for this? Deployment share with the $ at the end. And as you recall in Windows, with a $, this particular share will not show up by default. That doesn't mean that we're restricting access to it. It only makes it invisible. So we're going to use the default of deployment share $ on this particular server to be able to make that work. You can see the deployment share description. The MDT deployment share is a fine description to me. And when performing a new computer or bare metal deployment into a workgroup, the deployment wizard will normally ask if an image should be captured. This can be skipped if not required, and we can just leave the default here of ask if an image should be captured. We also have the option to set a local administrator account password during the imaging process. So this is an opportunity where you could say, ask the user to set the local password on the computer, or maybe you would like to administratively set that password when that particular image is deployed. You can make that decision right here in the user interface. Also during deployment, if you recall near the end, you're asked for a key. So you can put in the licensing key for this. Sometimes you might not want to have your users input the license key. So you can choose to ask or not ask the user for the product key. And once the summary view gives you a list of everything that's here. Once you're finished with that, you can click next to execute it. And now it begins creating this deployment share, and you can see everything went by pretty quick. It tells you exactly what happened, and it added that deployment share to the drive list. So here's our deployment share. Now we've created a place that if we went to another machine and we wanted to image that machine, we've created a central share now where we could actually have our images, but we haven't added an image yet. So I'm going to right mouse click and choose some properties for this deployment share. This gives you an idea of all of the different settings and things that you can do inside of the deployment share. The rules that were added, those were the rules I added very early when we were working through the creation of this deployment share. The Microsoft Windows PE settings components for both 32-bit and 64-bit views. So you could see when we had to do this in the DISM and modify our own Windows PE, we had to do a lot of this manually. Inside of the deployment workbench, we can simply choose by clicking exactly what we would like. That makes it very, very easy to do. Now that we built our central share that we can have other machines access to do its Windows 7 deployment, let's add some Windows 7 to this so that we can then deploy that. So let's click on the plus sign for our deployment shares. Let's click on the plus sign for the MDT deployment share, and you're going to see a number of things begin to pop up. We've got applications, operating systems, out-of-box drivers, packages, task sequences, and then some advanced configuration options as well. So this looks very similar to some of the things that we added using the DISM command. Let's start with adding our operating system to the mix. There are no items currently in the view, so I'm going to right mouse click right on the operating systems and import operating systems. And it's going to bring us up to a wizard that will then allow us to choose a number of different things for this. We could choose a full set of source files from the Windows DVD, CD, or equivalent. We could choose a custom image file, a WIM file that we would like to deploy, or we can choose a Windows Deployment Services image. We'll learn a little bit more about WDS later on in this video. I'd like to pull in a full set of source files. We'll do this from scratch just as we did before with our customized XML files, our auto unattend files, and everything else. It says that we need to choose the source directory for that. And on this computer, I have out on the D drive the Windows 7 Ultimate DVD. So I'll add that in and we'll click next. And it says the destination directory name you'd like to choose for that, Windows 7 x86, is indeed that DVD. So we'll say that sounds fine to us, and says click next to execute. So that was pretty easy. It's now going to go out to the operating system, pull all of those files in. And that's a lot easier than some of the things that we did from the command line, because we were able to simply step through this wizard to get that done. Once it finishes adding all of the operating system files and importing them into our deployment workbench, we can then use those files and start customizing it by adding things like new drivers, change some of the settings in Windows, and a number of other things. The import was pretty quick. You can see that on that DVD, there was a Windows 7 starter image, a home basic image, a home premium, a professional, and an ultimate image. Usually when you get a Windows 7 DVD, it has all of these combined in that same WIM file, the install.wim file. So let's finish. And yes, there they are. We're going to be adding ultimate to that machine that we would like to deploy this to. So it's already there, and we'll be able to use that install WIM that is specific to Windows 7 Ultimate. Now, if you recall, in our previous videos, we added some monitor drivers, and we used DISM to mount the WIM file. We added the monitor drivers to it using the DISM commands. In this case, I'm simply going to right mouse click on the out-of-box drivers, choose import drivers. It asks me for the driver source directory, and I have it out here over the network. You can see it needs to connect to that machine out there to be able to pull those drivers in. It is under this folder, and it is this iDrive folder of images, and I want to import them. There's not duplicates here, so it's okay. We can not check that, and then click next to execute. It's going to go out. It found the INF file for the 2709W monitor and added it to our out-of-box drivers. That looks great. So you can see now it's added those Dell drivers. We can add other drivers to this as well. We can just have them ready to go in our deployment share if we'd like. We have other packages and things. If there's an operating system package that you would like to add, it even says we're looking for CAB files or MSU files. We're going to add them to this mix. If you recall, that's one of the things we could have also done with our DISM. I don't have any packages, so we're going to not choose that. Task sequences are great because now we can customize exactly the way things get installed and use different task sequences for different machines, even if we wanted to. I'm going to start a task ID. I'm just going to call it 0001. This is our test task sequence. And if you want to put comments in here, we can always keep comments. I always recommend that we document as much as possible when we're doing this in reality. And you'll notice there are some built-in task sequences already. Assist prep and capture, a standard client task sequence. If we're replacing, we have a task sequence already there, some custom and some other pieces in here too. Let's choose the standard client task sequence for deploying an operating system. Now we get to choose which one of these operating systems. It already knows which ones that we pulled in. I want to choose Windows 7 Ultimate for this one. I could not specify a product key, or I could put in a multiple activation key or a specific product key for this operating system on this person's computer. So you can have many different task sequences all set up for different people and have their individual product key in here if you wanted to. They simply need to start up their computer, and now they're going to be able to use their specific task sequence. I'm not going to specify a product key. I'm going to put that in manually during our installation. Now we can specify usernames, full name, organization, and the Internet Explorer homepage as well. A lot of customization that normally we'd have to do using some of those more advanced capabilities. And I could have my Windows user in the Messer Studios organization. And click Next. I could specify a local administrator password, and that sounds like a good idea. I don't want my users always necessarily having access to the local admin, so I'm going to set up the password myself right here. And when it's deployed, that's already set. Your users don't even get the prompt. And there's all the settings that we had set up. We'll click Next, and it adds that task sequence to the mix. And there's our task sequence. Now you've got other advanced configurations in here. We're not going to select particular profiles, link deployment shares, media, or database, but as you can see, a lot of additional capabilities here to really extend and customize exactly what you want to do for the deployment process. Now that I have this deployment share customized with the settings I'd like, I'm going to right mouse click and choose Update the Deployment Share, and it's going to take all of the tools and things necessary to deploy this and integrate all of the changes that we've made. I can optimize the boot image updating process. I can even compress the boot image. Sometimes that's necessary in certain environments, or completely regenerate the boot images. I'm going to use the default just to optimize the boot images and click Next. It's now going to go out. Notice it tells you make sure you have the latest x86 tools. It's referring to those tools that get installed with the Windows AIK. So again, if you don't have the Windows AIK installed, this is not going to work quite right. And it's going to build a boot image, and it's going to put the boot image into a WIM file, Windows PE WIM file with all those customizations. So before, when we had to customize our own WIM file and change some of the settings for the WIM, we had to go in and manually do that at the command line. Here, this deployment share is now being customized and building all of the boot disks that we're going to need without us ever having to type anything. We're going to get our ISO files from the MDT 2010 server, the Cheyenne server. I'm going to show you here from our local disk. There is that deployment share directory that we created originally. A lot of different folders in there. This is where it stores everything for us. The one we're interested in is this boot folder. And here they are, Light Touch PE x86.iso. That's the ISO file that we now need to take to another computer, boot it up, and see what happens. Now I want to take the ISO file that I've created and put it into a machine and boot up with that Windows PE ISO file. So I've got a Naquita Research Lab here. That Naquita Research Lab is got 20 gig on a hard drive, and I've already added that ISO file. Since this is a virtual machine, I can just add the ISO file, the Light Touch PE _ x86. So let's start her up and see what we get. What we should expect to see are the things that you would normally see when you're starting up any Windows PE file, any Windows PE boot CD or DVD. It begins the process of starting the Windows configuration and then getting that Windows PE to execute something for the deployment of Windows 7. When our view steps up here of this Windows PE, notice that you'll see a few things that are different. For instance, the background is customized for that Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. And now you can see this is a little bit different than the Windows PEs that we were using earlier. This one was already customized when we built that ISO file. And when it starts up, we can run the deployment wizard to install a new operating system. We can run the Windows recovery wizard, or we can exit to the command prompt. I want to run and install a new operating system on this completely blank machine. Well, the first thing that it tries to do now is go out and grab the deployment information, but before it can do that, you have to specify rights and permissions to be able to see that share. You can't just have anybody showing up and accessing that share. They need access on the network to be able to do that. I'm going to use my administrator account with the password, and it's the SGC domain. And with those credentials, it'll be able to see the share that's out there and start pulling in the files that it needs to begin the actual installation process. You can see that it's found already. There's a task sequence out there that we've created just for this machine. Obviously, I could have many different task sequences available. Let's click Next. It says configure the computer name. Let's go ahead and choose, this is my NACWDA Research Lab. So we'll call this computer the NRL, and let's click Next. We can join a domain with that. Maybe that's what we'd like to do to the SGC domain, and the credentials are ones that it remembers earlier, the administrator credentials I put in there. You'll need to add credentials into this if you're using other ones to join the domain, and that all looks good to me. Let's click Next. And it goes and says I can either restore user data and settings, or I can say do not restore user data and settings. If I am restoring it, I can specify a location there where I've used my USMT. If you recall, we did a video earlier where we used the user state migration tool to be able to save and then restore data. This can do the restoration for you. We're not going to restore user data in this case, so we'll simply click Next. Install in English, time and currency format English, United States English. That looks correct. This is in Mountain Time, so let's choose the Mountain Time zone. And then the administrator password we want to put in here. The administrator password for logging onto the computer after a restart. And we can add the administrator password into this. And I'm going to use one so that I can build it in here. And now they match. Let's click Next. I could also enable BitLocker. We're going to talk about BitLocker in a future video, where I am encrypting the drive itself, allowing us to really tighten down security. We probably should, since this is in a very important high security lab environment. For the purposes of what we're doing here, though, we don't need to enable it. Let's click Next, and it says ready to begin. Even shows you all of the details of the things that you just set, and off it goes. It begins the process of installing Windows 7. So even though I didn't have Windows 7 on any install media on this machine, and a lot of the things specific to Windows 7 in the configuration I didn't even set up. It didn't ask me for some of those. I simply said go out, grab that set of task sequences, and install the operating system. And now it goes through the normal process of installing Windows 7. In our previous videos, it was great that we went down to the command line and did all of these things manually. We captured images, we modified them with the DISM command, we created our own Windows PE, we created our own ISO files. All of those things are very important, especially if you're scripting and working down at that lower level. But as you can see, the Microsoft Windows Deployment Toolkit, the MDT 2010, really allows you a lot of flexibility and the ability to create these multiple images, multiple task sequences, which becomes very important when you're in larger environments. Another way to automate this Windows 7 deployment is something called the Windows Deployment Services Manager. Now, WDS has a lot more requirements to it. It's going to also require that you have an Active Directory domain services already running in your environment. You're going to have the NTFS file system on your WDS server. We need local administrator rights. And if you're going to be using this with the Pixie, you're going to need a DHCP server. That pre-boot environment really requires that you have this DHCP server to pull configuration information from, so that you don't have to put any installation media in a machine. It simply boots up with a specialized chip on the network card that finds the Pixie server, downloads what it needs for boot. So this makes it very easy to be able to deploy an operating system. You don't need to take any media with you to the desktop. You simply boot it up, and as long as it's able to use the network, it's able to then get the information it needs to be able to install the Windows 7. Now, WDS is also very graphical to work in. We're going to see that environment in just a moment, but there is a command line called WDS util. That command line allows us to do almost everything that we're doing in the graphical front end at the command line. And as we've seen before, having that command line function allows us to do scripting and a lot of things in an automated way. We're going to focus on using the graphical front end, but just keep in mind that there are similar functions available in WDS util as well. When you're working in WDS, you'll see a number of different kinds of images in there. The first one you'll see is the boot image. This is when you go to a remote machine, it has no operating system on it, or you've specified to boot from the network card. This is the image that is used to boot that computer. The network card boots this via something called PXE, the pre-boot execution environment. That PXE capability goes out to the network, finds a PXE server that's out there somewhere, and pulls down the image that it needs to boot from. So you don't need an ISO file, you don't need a memory stick or a DVD with boot information on it. You can simply use what's built into the computer. There are some older machines, however, that may not have capabilities for doing PXE. So for that, we'll need a Discover image. This is that traditional CD, DVD, that ISO file that allows it to find the WDS server with this particular image. So if you can't do PXE, you'll need a Discover image to take to that machine. The install image is the big one. It's the one that gets brought down all the way and installed onto someone's computer. And when you're setting up many, many computers at the same time to have this work, that's the one that's really going to pull down the big Windows 7 operating system. And the last one is a capture image. You can not only deploy Windows 7 with WDS, you can also capture an image from an existing computer with WDS and automate that process. And that is a special image that allows us to start that process up and capture everything that's on that computer. You'll find your WDS once you install it in the All Programs under your Administrative Tools Windows Deployment Services. This is a central console that allows you to manage WDS across many different servers. In my environment, I just have a single server here, and you can see install images, boot images, legacy images, pending devices, and multicast transmissions are all configured from here. What I'd like to do is add an install image. I have one already we created in a previous video. It was that lab machine running Windows 7 Ultimate. We customized it. It was perfect for rolling out. So I'm going to right mouse click and add an install image. And the first thing it says is, wait, you haven't added a group yet to put these images in. That's a method that Windows Deployment Services uses to keep these things organized. So I'm going to use the default of image group 1 and simply create the new image there. Then it says, where's the WIM that you'd like to add to this? And out on my desktop, I have that Windows 7 Ultimate Lab Windows image file that I'm going to include in this WDS server. And there's the description of it, the Windows 7 Ultimate Research Lab. That was the one that we created. That sounds good. Well, it's an x86 architecture. We'll click Next. And the images that we've selected for this is the one. And now it's going to add it into our Windows Deployment Services server. Now that we have an image installed for our operating system, we also need a boot image inside of here. I'm going to go down to the boot images folder and right mouse click and choose Add Boot Image. That will take you through an Add Image wizard where first it says, where do you want to get this image from? And I'm going to choose the image that is on my D drive, my Windows Ultimate Boot Media, and I'm going to choose in my sources directory the boot.wim. So this is going to match the same boot file that I would normally boot from for Windows. And I'll click Open, and then we'll click Next, and it says this is the Windows Setup Boot image. That's exactly what I'd like. And click the Next, and it's going to copy over and add the boot image from our original Windows DVD right into the Windows Deployment Services front end. Now we have a Windows image on our computer, and we have a boot image we can boot from. So now let's try to use that image on a test machine. Now let's start up our virtual machine here, the Nakoda Research Lab, and I'm going to have my finger ready on that F12 button because once it gets a DHCP address, it asks to press F12 for a network boot, and then it begins booting very quickly from that network boot file, and you can see it's already pulling across our images here, the boot.wim image that we specified as the boot image for this machine. So as you can see, it's really just that easy. Once you're at a machine that is PXE compliant, that is able to do a pre-boot execution environment, then all we need to do is start up the machine. It will find an IP address automatically from our DHCP server. Then it will find where it needs to pull these PXE files from, and it starts to load up the images that it needs to start up the computer. Even though we don't have any boot media with us, the machine doesn't have any operating system on the hard drive, does it all across the network. Once that image has been pulled across, it's going to start the normal Windows setup process. So at this point, we've already begun the process for Windows. It goes through the installation and begins a normal setup and goes through the entire process with our image file. That makes it a little bit different than running it from media that you would have taken to the machine. And of course, one of the big benefits with WDS is you can do this on many machines all simultaneously. The two methods we've seen already have been light touch methods, but if you wanted to do a true zero touch installation, you would use something like System Center Configuration Manager, or SCCM 2007. This is something you would use in an enterprise. This is really what we call enterprise change and configuration management, because it doesn't just deploy images. I can do any type of software deployment from here. I can do software metering. Maybe you've bought a certain number of licenses of a piece of software. You can have this device manage the metering of who's using that software just to make sure you don't go over your licensing agreement. It does inventory of your computers, not just the software on those computers, but the hardware as well. And it does a number of remote administration functions, all using SCCM. So you can see this is something you really do have in very large environments that need some of these automated tools and techniques to be able to do this. For true zero touch, you integrate this with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010, and now you've got a complete solution for sending out an image, having it install automatically, and then pushing out the updates to applications and patches and drivers that you might need. The scope of SCCM really is quite broad. You have command line control of these computers that are out in your domain. Again, you can do those software installations and updates using SCCM. You also have ways to manage what devices are on the domain and what devices are not. If you need to restart the computers that are out there, you can also do that with SCCM, even down to lower level things like partitioning disks and doing user state information. We already did some of that manually ourselves. I can also, of course, image computers that are out there. And as you've seen with some of the things that we've managed, driver management becomes pretty important. I can also do that using SCCM. Let's review some of the things that we've learned in this video. Our first question is, what is needed to provide a zero-touch installation, a ZTI? And of course, to be able to do that, we need that enterprise management function that's provided in either the older SMS, which is the Systems Management Server 2003, or the new System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM 2007. The next question is, when would you use a WDS Discover image? That's a very particular kind of image that's used in our Windows deployment services, and that is when you have a machine that doesn't support Pixie and you still need to boot from it. You would need an image that can discover where that happens to be out on the network. And our last question, what software is required to use the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit? That MDT needs some utilities that are already installed in a previous package called the Windows Automated Installation Kit, or the AIK. That covers the requirements for this video. You've learned now how to do some of these automated deployments along with some of the manual deployments we've done in previous videos. Of course, we have many Microsoft 680 videos to choose from. You might want to participate in our message boards or send me a message, all from our website at professormesser.com.